Hi Bio4 and welcome to chapter 23, the respiratory system. We are so moving along here. We've only got a few more systems to go after this. So let's think of function always. That's sort of how we start. Why do we have this respiratory system? It's to transport air to the lungs, to get air into those lungs, and to then exchange that oxygen and carbon dioxide between the air and the blood, right? And one that we think about less is when you're bringing air in, past your larynx, you are able to actually vibrate that and produce sound. So that's another function of your respiratory system, to create sound. The word respiration itself, let's think about it, what it involves. It involves breathing, right? Breathing is getting air into the lung. That's breathing. And then external respiration is getting it from the lung towards the blood, in the region, the vicinity of the blood. So we're going to get it into those capillaries. And that you might not think of exactly being very external when you're thinking about blood, but it is, because there's yet another step, and that would be the internal respiration, where we're getting it from the blood into the actual cells. And that would be considered internal respiration. So you know already that there are two systems that supply oxygen and eliminate carbon dioxide from the body. It's not just the respiratory, correct? It's the respiratory alongside the cardiovascular. So those two are going to work together to make this happen. And we've already been studying the cardiovascular. So here we jump into the anatomy right away. Let me just give you an overview, and then we'll come back to all these terms. You have the nasal cavity, and you have the nasal concha. Remember when you looked at this, when we were looking at the skull. Here there's bone, so that makes it hard palate. And then beyond that is going to be soft palate, where there's no longer bone. Your nostril, your pharynx. So the pharynx here is a tube that shares both food and air. Oh my, that can cause problems. So I'm not sure I would have designed it that way, to have a tube that does both, because you get bagel coming down here and you get air coming down here, and if you just don't swallow right or laugh while you're eating that bagel, well, bagel might end up in the trachea, and that is a choking scenario. So just remember that pharynx is really the tube that allows the passage of both of those. And then when you get further down into the region of the larynx, it's going to separate, and air is going to go in the trachea and food is going to go. Do you notice it's behind here? Is in the esophagus. Then we go down to the lungs, and all this should be familiar to you. Okay, moving on. We're going to divide it into upper respiratory then and lower respiratory system. And the upper respiratory is everything above the larynx. So all structures superior to the larynx, the nose, the nasal cavity, the pharynx, all those are going to be upper respiratory. And they're going to be in charge of intake, bringing air in, moistening that air, because we don't want this very dry air reaching the alveoli. Filtering that air. We've got lots of devices for in our nose, even little hairs that are going to be filtering out particles that are coming in with that air. And then it's sensory too, right? You are able to smell that wonderful bagel that's baking or cake through those neurons that are in that region. Upper respiratory. What about lower? So lower respiratory system, then we start from the larynx again, right? Anything below the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, and the lungs. And functions, remember, are going to be sound production, the transport of air that we talked about, and also gas exchange. So gas exchange is getting it out of the lung and into the blood, remember at first, and then from the blood into the cells. That's the lower respiratory system. So the primary entrance to the respiratory system includes bone, right? We have nasal bone, that whole area, and cartilage, a lot of cartilage, and you have your external nares. That's the anatomical term, really your nostrils. That's all it is. And those nostrils or nares lead to nasal cavities. that still in your nose is separated by a nasal septum, okay, going in right or left. So let's look here, and we would see external nares. There's that term again, right, which is nothing but nostril. You remember the nasal concha, superior, middle, and inferior nasal concha. So all this is the nasal cavity. So nasal cavity area, and then internal nares are sort of this region here beyond the actual nose. In this diagram, I want to alert you to something right away, even though we'll come back to the diagram later. Let's say air is coming down here, and you have air coming down. You're not swallowing, you're just breathing. That air is going to be able to come like this and come more anteriorly here to the trachea. Notice where the esophagus is posterior to the trachea. Now, what has to happen when we want food, a bolus of food, to go down the esophagus and not into the trachea, is this epiglottis will close up this entryway into the trachea and not allow anything to come in this way. See, this is where it would change that way. If we close this up, then we put this lid, the epiglottis, this lid, it's going to close this up and not let that bagel come into the trachea. Okay, some other interesting things to look at are your tonsils, your palatine tonsils here in the back of the tongue, posterior. Your adenoids, which are your pharyngeal tonsils, are more, posterior to the nose. And the entrance to the auditory tube. So that is where you're going to drain too much fluid in here into the throat and swallow it. Okay, so you get, the ear is draining into here, and then you are able to swallow that. So it's the drain. And the rest we'll get to all these other structures. There's a lot of names here. Okay, so looking at those again, this is the region of bone. The rest is all cartilage. Your nares then are the entryway, or your nostril. So when people say that they actually broke their nose, they don't mean that they broke the bone here, usually. They mean they broke the cartilage, or they did something to the septum. So broken nose isn't always a bone. It's often the actual cartilage. The nasal cavity itself is formed by the superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchae that we saw already when you looked at the skull, which is so great. And remember what they do? Those conchae are there because they create turbulence when air comes in. They sort of crash along those walls and go in every direction. And the purpose of that is that it takes longer in this cavity, and then it's able to warm it up and humidify it before it enters the trachea. Also beneath the superior, middle, and inferior conchae are the meatus. So the conchae is the hill, essentially, and the meatus is the valley. Okay, I'm going to stop there. That's part 1 of the respiratory system. Thanks for listening.